Hello, History72B. I am your host, Karen, and just Karen, please. I try to avoid using my last name as much as possible. I use it on official paperwork, but not for anything other than that. We are halfway through Module E, Sex Among the Victorians. I've called this third topic in the set Society because I want to look a bit at what non-elite people faced in navigating life in 19th century America. We have been examining the development of scientists and doctors as authoritative figures in the West. We have also looked at the hegemonic cult of true womanhood and considered that this was an impossible ideal even for privileged women. But what about everyone else? Obviously, we won't get to look at everyone, but I'll give you something of an overview. It would be hard to overstate how important and radical the ability to have sex without the possibility of conception was. So we will be looking at the development of birth control and power struggles over who could and could not have access to it. But being able to stop conception is only one part of reproductive rights. For example, there is also the issue of being able to safely gestate and deliver a baby, and the ability to raise a child where they will have the best chance of surviving. We are going to start in the 19th century here and then loop back just enough to give you a basic background in birth control leading up to the Victorian era. We already know that most women were disqualified from true womanhood right from the start. This included women of color as well as poor women. At the start of the 19th century, most of the U.S. was agrarian, meaning farm communities. Farm women, especially on Western settlements, did not have the luxury of being true women who stayed in the home and didn't get too muscular. Nevertheless, the cult of true womanhood affected all of these different women in one way or another. Remember, part of the point of an impossible ideal is the impossible part. For privileged women, even if the ideal was impossible, striving for the ideal was recognized as a noble goal. All other women still had to work within the basic social expectations of the ideal because they risked being treated even more callously than they already were by those who wanted to assert some degree of power. It was not only women who were affected by the cult of true womanhood. Part of the requirement involved a man financially supporting his family on his income alone. Remember, this was the ideal, not reality. This was an impossibility for some American men most of the time, and for most American men, at least some of the time. Children were expected to be pleasant and clean and well-behaved by hegemonic standards, which, as we have seen in the last lecture, included obeying gender rules. The ideals of the public and private sphere construction impacted power structures in relationships of all kinds, at all levels, for all people in North America. Some of you may be thinking, why would women who could never live up to the ideals of the cult of true womanhood even bother? Consider, as we know, part of the power of hegemonic constructions is that they saturate a society. The rules become part of just the way it is. And generally, in order to survive, most people try to get by in the world they have, even if they are trying to change it. Many of you are taking this class because it fills a requirement in order to get your degree. You may grumble about it, but here you are. Many of you are also well aware of inequities in public education, and I would guess that a number of you are active in social justice causes. But what none of us do, because we really cannot, is get up one morning and say, today I am going to completely dismantle and fix the American education system. Well, we might say it, but we cannot actually make it happen alone in a day, or even with other people in many days. It takes many, many people, many, many days. Some control relating to education is overt, meaning open and obvious, and is overseen by government, even if you never experience it yourself. Truancy, or missing 10% or more of school days in K-12 in California, is subject to penalties for the parents, including fines or jail time, and the same for the student if they are over 13. This is something that tends to hit those who cannot afford it the hardest. Some control is more subtle, and we don't always think of it as control by hegemonic power structures, but it is. Ultimately, you are all taking a college course because you know that having or not having a college degree can make a substantial difference in your life, and you worked hard enough before this that you have been accepted to UC Davis. We may think the system is completely unfair. We may protest parts of it. Yet here we are, because this is part of the way that we have found to navigate our personal position in our own historical context. So even those women excluded from true womanhood still had their lives controlled by the existence of the cult of true womanhood to a degree. They were still expected to keep homes clean and neat. They were still expected to care for husband and children, and they were still expected to have children. That last one is critical. For most people before the 19th century, a reality of sexual intercourse, pleasant or not, was reproduction. Most women expected to give birth at least once, and usually much more in their life. Different forms of birth control, usually barrier methods, existed before the 19th century, but they were often not particularly effective. This meant that in people's minds, especially in the minds of those who could get pregnant, sex, like pregnancy and childbirth, was just one part of reproduction. On the one hand, this seems obvious, right? Sexual intercourse, sperm, egg, fertilization, reproduction. We know this, but it is not quite the same thing to know something intellectually and to live it when there is pretty much no other option. No latex condoms, no IUDs, certainly no hormone-regulating pills. Puritan women typically had 7 children over the course of their reproductive lives. Even through the 18th century in rural, agrarian, or farming regions, that number of births would not be unusual. Prior to the late 19th century, in both rural and urban areas, the number of births rarely equaled the number of children a woman had by the time she went through menopause, assuming that she lived to menopause. Stillbirths were a fact of life. Infant mortality was high, and illnesses that are uncommon or completely non-existent in 21st century America, like cholera, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and smallpox, took a toll on children. Some scholars estimate that about half of children made it to their 5th birthday in the 18th century. Sometimes people think that because children died so often, that it was not as difficult for parents, but this is not true. The picture you are looking at is from 1776. The artist painted his wife mourning their child, who has died and is laid out for burial. Generally, people loved their children, but death was an ever-present part of people's reality in the absence of antibiotics or vaccines or disinfectants. It was not just children who died. Estimates vary, and for 18th century America, these are necessarily estimates, but approximately 1 out of every 8 births, I'll say that again, 1 out of every 8 births resulted in the death of the mother. Often this was from infection following birth. Childbirth, especially repeated childbirth, could cause severe damage to women's bodies. We talked about the development of American gynecology and the women who were used as test subjects. The surgeries developed were then used on women of all classes and status. All women, no matter how elite, were vulnerable to damage from childbirth, like fistula, which is an internal tearing between the vagina and the rectum, and from repeated childbirth, such as a prolapsed uterus, which means that it starts to descend down the vagina rather than staying in place. This was the reality of sexual intercourse for anyone who could get pregnant. And we know from letters and diaries that this was in at least the back of their mind whenever they had sexual intercourse. Why would anyone agree to go through this? In rural areas in the US and Europe, children were part of the labor force. If you only had a couple of children and they didn't live, or if you had no children at all, You would literally be on your own if you had an accident or when you grew old. Sometimes the town you lived in might take care of you, but that care would be grudging and minimal at best. All of this was even more true for women than for men. As we know, under coverture law in England and the US, most women were economically dependent. They might handle household finances, but once the husband died, they were legally entitled to very little. Regardless of what the status purpose of coverture law was, one of the effects was to make life particularly tenuous and uncertain for women who did not have children. For the family as a social unit in farming regions, having lots of children made sense. Not all children would live, they provided much needed labor, and they could be fed and clothed fairly cheaply. But as the US started to become more urban and industrial, the cost-benefit analysis for children changed, except for the most elite. In a money economy, wage workers, whether impoverished factory hands or middle-class managers, were no longer independent landowners. Urban living was expensive at any level relative to the wages that people made, and children in this situation cost more than they could contribute to the family. For the most impoverished urban classes, child labor in factories was the norm, but children were paid less than adults, women were paid less than men, and men were paid starvation wages and could never be certain of getting work from day to day. No job security. The professional middle class spent large amounts of money on education for their children in the hopes that those children would not drop down out of the middle class. You are looking at the 1869 Antioch College baseball team compared to families you've seen in earlier slides. You could tell, I hope, that the world of the educated was quite different to the world of others. Middle to upper class families could afford to feed and care for many children, but they didn't. Their concerns and calculations differed from the rural and urban working classes. The mortality rate for middle and upper class children wasn't zero, but it wasn't anywhere close to the mortality rate for poor children. The greatest fear of the middle class was that their children might drop down out of the middle class, and their greatest hope was that their children would climb higher. For boys, that meant expensive educations. For girls, it meant marriage to boys with expensive educations, which was itself expensive. Middle-class white families in cities had a small number of children and invested all of their resources in those children. In urban areas going into the 19th century, the birth rate declined among all classes, from the poor to the upper middle, which tells us that people had some form of birth control. Total abstinence year after year is not likely to have been consistently practiced by families for years, much less for decades. You were looking at the types of birth control available and practiced going into the 19th century industrial world. Infanticide, abortion, withdrawal by the male or coitus interruptus, suppositories, those would be powders, creams, and so on, placed in the vagina to obstruct access to the cervix. Diaphragms, caps, etc., inserted over the cervix and withdrawn after intercourse. Internal medicines, potions, or pills, not the hormonal kind. Douching, intended to kill or rinse out sperm. Condoms, and rhythm methods, avoiding intercourse when a woman was presumed to be most fertile. You will, I am sure, note that infanticide heads the list. In the classical Mediterranean world, infanticide was not considered murder, and it was not primarily the practice of women. The classical Greek city-states with limited land practiced infanticide as a form of population control. Aristotle and Plato recommended infanticide with newborns that did not appear healthy enough to survive or to contribute useful labor to society as adults. Now, let's be clear, not all societies were like this, but Western society owes a great debt to Greek and Roman antiquity. Imperial Rome did legislate against infanticide, but did not actually enforce this law often. The statue you are looking at is Romulus and Remus, who are supposedly responsible for the founding of Rome. They were, as the legend goes, abandoned and rescued by a lactating wolf. In a world with not only high infant mortality, but high mortality overall, newborns, who might very well die, were not considered fully human. This doesn't mean that parents were necessarily happy, but the grief for infanticide fell into the same group as that for miscarriage or stillbirth. The spread of Christianity complicated matters because now newborns might have souls, but well through the medieval period, infanticide by exposure, while not common, was also not unheard of. Abortion was far more prevalent than infanticide. If newborns were not considered human, the fetus was not considered a living thing, but rather a part of the mother until quickening. Quickening is when the mother can first feel the movements of the fetus inside. This is not actually an obvious thing, and there is a month or so when it is sort of a matter of desire, whether a woman interprets an unsettled abdomen as movements of a fetus as opposed to intestinal distress or wind. Depending on time and place, through the Enlightenment, abortion technology varied. Could be based on herbs or folk medicine, or it could be mechanical, could be internal or external. It often involved inserting something through the cervix and into the uterus. When it came to herbal medicines, either consumed or placed in the vagina, there was often no clear distinction between contraception and abortion. There were no CVS or medical pregnancy tests, and although there are certain physical changes that come with pregnancy, these are generally not unique to pregnancy for several months at least, even the absence of menses. When it came to any of the abortion techniques, herbal or mechanical, anesthesia was not an option. Abortion was fairly common, but it was in no way painless or even always effective. Several of the items that would prevent pregnancy, withdrawal, rhythm method, and condom use required the cooperation of the sperm depositing partner in sexual intercourse. While middle-class men were often interested in preventing pregnancy as well as women, the first two methods, withdrawal and rhythm, require either a certain amount of self-control or figuring out women are most fertile. And you may remember that a fair understanding of ovulation and actual conception did not develop until the mid-19th century. The rhythm method was at best a gamble. Condoms were not latex or anything related, not even rubber. Sheep's intestine, softer types of leather, or cloth were common materials used. These often did not provide an enjoyable or even comfortable experience for either partner. You are looking at a linen condom from the Renaissance, 16th century, 1500s. Douching or rinsing the vagina could be done by a woman after intercourse as long as her partner did not prevent it. Substances like citrus juice and vinegar do have slight spermicidal properties. The recipes for douching liquids or lotions usually included a mixture of ingredients. One recipe from the 19th century, the 1800s, included dichloride of mercury, almond milk, alcohol, and rose water. Suppositories or pessaries, substances or objects placed in the vagina to block access to the cervix, could be inserted by a woman before intercourse. These were actually some of the most effective forms of birth control. Oil or mixtures containing oil were common right through to the end of the 19th century. There were no manufactured sponges, but by the mid to late 19th century, there were natural sponges. Sponges are sea creatures before they are harvested to become absorbent tools for humans. This method, the sponge, was still in use in the 1930s, and a study at that time found that at 50%, 50% effectiveness, a sponge was the most reliable form of contraception at the time. You might wonder why women several decades into the 20th century were still using things like natural sponges. With all of the discoveries in medicine and biology by that point, surely someone had designed something better. And that brings us to birth control in the 19th century. Reproductive control is not just a matter of reducing pregnancies and births, but also of being able to choose to have children and have a safe environment in which to raise them. I've put a few terms we'll cover in part 2 up on the slide. They relate to the struggle for women to choose when and how many children to have, improvements of birth control, and the backlash to birth control from upper class and upper class hopeful white men. The class of men most dedicated to the cult of true womanhood were the doctor, scientist, politician class. One of the effects of this hegemonic set of expectations for women was that it could be used to isolate middle to upper class women in the home to an extent, and to convince women generally that motherhood was their one true purpose, and indeed the only thing that they were good for. You can imagine that most of these men, the scientists, the doctors, the politicians, were not going to be at the forefront of designing birth control or improving abortion techniques. And indeed, modern medicine did not aid in the development of birth control until the mid-20th century. That's the 1950s. The methods of birth control available at the end of the 19th century and going into the 20th were the same ones that were available at the very beginning of the 19th century. Nevertheless, if we look at fertility rates in the US from 1800 to 2020, this is what we see. The low point, about 2/3 of the way across, is World War II, and the bounce after that is the baby boom. But through the 19th century, the fertility rate dropped fairly continuously in the US. People were practicing birth control and doing it more as industrialization, urbanization, and wealth stratification increased through the 19th century. People were using the methods that they had. Despite the emphasis on motherhood, more and more women in all classes and all race groups were limiting their childbearing. The upper working to middle class faced the stigma of illegitimacy for any children born out of wedlock and social exclusion for the woman, not a small thing when society was designed to make women economically dependent on men. The working poor often couldn't afford to feed children beyond a certain number. All of these women in all of those classes practiced all of the birth control methods we've talked about to a certain extent, including infanticide, although not to the same degree, depending on their options. Infanticide was primarily a practice of the desperately poor right through the 19th century. Abortion was far more common than infanticide among all classes. We have some estimates of 19th century abortion rates from urban areas. For example, in 1904, Chicago averaged around 6,000 to 10,000 abortions per year. New York City is estimated to have been even higher. Abortions were illegal and they were risky, but they were actually far less risky for women in the 19th to early 20th century than childbirth. Studies in the early 20th century showed that among pregnant women who died, around 13.5% died from abortions, 86.5% died in childbirth. Although abortions were illegal in the US from the beginning of the 19th century, they were only illegal from quickening on. Quickening usually happens around 16 to 25 weeks, closer to 25 in first pregnancies, and in cases where a woman is not specifically looking for it or is specifically hoping not to feel it. So in effect, abortions were legal until about 5 months in. Courts upheld this interpretation of the legality of abortion before quickening until 1845. But how did women find doctors who would perform abortions or treatments that would end a pregnancy? Part of the cult of true womanhood was that not only were women supposed to be passionless, they weren't supposed to discuss anything related to sex. Doesn't mean that they obeyed that rule, but that was the rule. For the middle classes, the Victorian constraint on women talking about all things sex, combined with the movement of couple-based family to a city away from extended social and familial ties, meant that what birth control practices did exist in rural areas, and these were generally passed between women, were lost. For the working poor in cities, many had immigrated to the US from Europe. This meant that they were even more completely disconnected from extended family and community. Communities, no longer formed on familiar lines, ceased to be the source of birth control knowledge, but all was not lost. The Industrial Revolution also saw an explosion in printed forms of communication, not just books, but newspapers and pamphlets. Birth control advertisements became common, and even though only about half of poor urban women could read initially, women formed friendship networks to share information in the absence of older rural networks. So information could travel by word of mouth, even if only a minority could read the original advertisements. Abortion was still illegal, so doctors advertising these services or people selling abortificants sometimes used euphemisms. French meant birth control. For example, a French letter was a condom. Portuguese signified abortificants. So ads might be worded like this: Portuguese female pills, not to be used during pregnancy as they will cause miscarriage, which basically means if you want to have a miscarriage, use these pills. But because abortion was only illegal after quickening through the mid-1840s, there were also ads for products to help bring on menstruation if it became irregular. In other words, if you missed a period because you were pregnant. These ads would say something along the lines of, the medicine or doctor's services would bring relief or remove obstacles for women experiencing irregular menstruation. Many doctors in the 19th century opposed abortion. Many more opposed it publicly, but performed the procedure for their wealthy clients at a cost of about $4,000 in today's terms. Abortion services were stratified by cost and treatment, so cheaper and more painful abortions were available even to the poor. Sometimes these were performed by the same doctors who served the wealthy. These doctors would keep two clinics, one for the rich and one for the poor. Unless she had the support of family or friends, the middle-class woman was generally consigned to clinics for the poor. The availability of birth control and abortion changed drastically after the mid-19th century, however. Beginning around the 1840s, upper middle to upper class women began to form what is often called the first wave of feminism, protesting the coverture system, the economic and legal powers of husbands over wives, and of course the fact that women were generally denied the right to vote. The response to this activity by women was a sustained backlash against all women. The medical industry began to denounce abortions more often and more strenuously. Professional meetings, as well as both professional and popular journals, became filled with anti-abortion tracts. As a group, doctors condemned abortions, but some doctors would still perform abortions in exceptional cases. Exceptional was often code for either the man or the woman involved had money, and there were still backstreet abortions available to many of the poor and middle class, although the fact that abortion was illegal made it less safe. A woman dying from an abortion but found before her actual death could be asked to make a dying declaration, naming her abortionist and possibly the man involved in the pregnancy. Because both the man involved in the pregnancy and the abortionist could face prosecution for their part, women who were obviously going to die and who could reveal names might be left alone in a rented room to die out of sight. Abortions became a bit more difficult to obtain and less safe, especially for the non-elite, by mid-century, but birth control also improved. Rubber condoms became available after the 1850s. Advertisements for syringes for douching appeared in newspapers in response to the 19th century fashion for routine cleansing, along with powders or lotions intended to help with the cleanse. This meant that they were claimed to have spermicidal properties. Women, including middle-class women, to the annoyance of proponents of the cult of true womanhood, continued to limit their fertility. more and more women in the upper half of society attended colleges, and those in the lower half not only entered the paid workforce in increasing numbers, they formed labor unions and asked for things like livable wages. The second group photos of graduates are from Oberlin College in the 1850s. Oberlin was the first college in the US to admit women and to hold coeducational classes as well as unsegregated classes. The backlash to women controlling their own fertility increased as well. The Comstock Law, passed in 1873, prohibited any form of birth control. It did this by outlawing the use of the Postal Service to send obscene matter, and the Comstock Law specifically defined any discussion of birth control as obscene. Advertisements for birth control, no matter how obliquely worded, were now illegal. And Comstock, the man who gave his name to the law, and his followers in law enforcement and the judiciary enforced this law zealously. Lest you think that this law was about protecting health or any concern at all for women, it was obvious to everyone concerned that Comstock's group was aimed at reining in women who made too many decisions for themselves. This was clear in many ways, but the wording of charges leveled against people arrested for breaking the Comstock Law were remarkably clear. The charges against one woman read, "By the syringes which she recommends and sells, she," and here's the key part of the quote, "places it within the power of wives to prevent conception." There's not even a pretense there that the concern is actually for young men and women who might be tempted into sin by the availability of birth control. While the backlash against birth control was meant largely to control women of the higher echelons of society, it was the poor who were most effectively policed, and the poor who bore the biggest burden from this legislation. Women and men with enough money and skilled, respectable doctors could obtain not only abortions, but IUDs. That stands for intrauterine device. IUDs are still in use now. They are generally inserted into the uterus by medical professionals. Some quite respectable doctors, including more than a few who were outspoken opponents of birth control, also made things like sponges and spermicidal lotions available to respectable clients who needed them. Perhaps one of the most glaring examples of the class double standard when it came to birth control involved advertisements placed by corporations. For example, an advertisement for Vaseline contained this statement, purportedly from a physician. So this is the quote, and it's not on the ad that's in front of you. You have to go to the archives. You have to go to the archives to get a look at this, but it's quoted in different places. In some cases of this kind, prevention is better than cure, and I am inclined to think from some experiments that Vaseline, charged with 4 or 5 grains of salicylic acid, will destroy spermatozoa without injury to the uterus or vagina. Salicylic acid is the active ingredient in aspirin, but the Vaseline part of the ad is the most interesting here. Vaseline was owned in part by the Samuel Colgate Company. Samuel Colgate was the head of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, one of the main backers of Comstock's crusade to make birth control unavailable. And the ad doesn't even use euphemisms. Spermatozoa, uterus, and vagina are just all right there. Colgate was not arrested or prosecuted for promoting or distributing obscene material. By the 1870s, what historians now identify as first-wave feminism had developed more fully. I will remind you that, not at all coincidentally, the Comstock Law passed in 1873. Although women's suffrage has come to be the most recognized goal of the first wave, it was most certainly not the only issue addressed. There were a number of feminist organizations, and they included women beyond the upper classes. These organizations often disagreed with one another quite publicly, but we are not going to enter the weeds of early feminist disputes here. The ability of women, particularly married women, to choose when they wished to become pregnant became an avowedly feminist issue. The slogan used by 19th century feminists as a group including both women and men, was voluntary motherhood. None of the feminists who backed voluntary motherhood were anti-marriage or anti-family. They still existed in a world in which the basic tenets of the cult of true womanhood seemed natural and even desirable to a point. This meant that many of these feminists did not back any of the birth control methods we've discussed so far. They made use of the assumptions of the cult of true womanhood, motherhood, and passionlessness to push their cause. The idea was that women who could space their pregnancies would do what was best for the family, particularly the children that they did have. What these feminists were arguing for was the right of married women to refuse sexual intercourse with their husbands, sometimes. Both law and practice in the United States in the 19th century made constant sexual submission to her husband part of a wife's duty. A woman's right to refuse, advocated under the slogan voluntary motherhood, was a fundamental condition, not only of birth control, but of a woman's independence and personal integrity as a human. So far, we've seen that greater demands for women's rights and autonomy met with increasing backlash from people in positions of power. Perhaps the most well-known of those people was Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States. Roosevelt tapped into an idea already growing by the end of the 19th century called race suicide. You've seen that the birth rate dropped for all women over the course of the 19th century. It dropped for college-educated men as well, but they were not perceived as part of the problem. The race suicide idea rose in part from the fear of the elite class that they would not be able to pass on their large fortunes or political power. Their ideas of inheritance still largely followed the English practice of primogeniture, which meant that only male children and only the first male, the eldest male child, could inherit. This worked well with the cult of true womanhood as it kept women, this being the idea of race suicide. This worked well with the cult of true womanhood as it kept women at all levels of society economically dependent on men. Theodore Roosevelt spoke for many upper-class or upper-class hopeful men when he condemned the trend toward lower birth rates and smaller families among the white educated classes as decadent and a sign of moral disease. Roosevelt directed his greatest criticisms at women, saying that anyone, and at white women, I should clarify there, saying that anyone who avoided having children was a criminal against the race, and that such women were the object of contemptuous abhorrence. Those are his words. The invocation of race suicide grew from fears not only of losing the privilege of whiteness, but the intertwined privileges of sex and class as well. The anger raised by these fears was directed not only at white middle to upper class women, but also against immigrants. Proponents of race suicide argued that immigrants from Europe were coming to the US and having tons of children. One race suicide proponent claimed, and this is a quote, "The Italians are just like animals. They produce as freely and naturally, and they expect their children to look after themselves." There are a couple of ways the cult of true womanhood is used to exclude and vilify poor people there in that quote. The first and most obvious is equating poor people with non-human animals. The other is the reasoning that underlies the animal analogy. Children of the urban poor often did have to shift for themselves. This was not due to a lack of parental feeling or desire to care for these children. It came from the fact that both parents, as well as any older siblings, had to work in order to feed anyone in the family. This strategy of denying a group of people the ability to form a hegemonic ideal of a Victorian family and then using the fact that they did not form families that conformed to the ideal of the stay-at-home mother was used before and even more aggressively against enslaved and newly freed people in the South. There were four fundamental claims of the race suicide theorists. First, that white women in the 19th century bore fewer children than women in previous centuries, and that one was true. Second, that the decline in fertility was deliberate. That one was also true. Third, that respectable white people had far lower fertility rates than people of color, immigrants, the working class, and the so-called underclass. Taken as a whole, meaning not cherry picking a particular group at a particular point in time, that one was not true. And fourth, that fertility rates had abruptly begun to decline only in the last 1/3 of the 19th century. You've seen the graph of the actual data, which showed an incredibly steady decline from the beginning to the end of the 19th century in the US. So that one is clearly not true. For the groups that we've looked at in this lecture so far, individual women might be forced into pregnancy, and legal changes made it difficult to access birth control and abortion. But none of these groups as a group faced forced pregnancy. For the first 6.5 decades of the 19th century, forced pregnancy was precisely the situation for enslaved women, particularly in the South. Remember that slavery was not confined only to the American South. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1864 at the end of the American Civil War. This was the amendment that ended the enslavement of humans at all levels of government from the federal down. The transatlantic slave trade had become illegal in the United States in 1808. The domestic slave trade had not. This meant that enslavers in the U.S. could no longer count on enslaved people brought directly from Africa, but they could buy and sell people as property within the borders of the U.S., and that is precisely what they did. Without the transatlantic slave trade, the enslaved workforce could only be replaced by reproduction. So enslavers had an even greater interest in controlling the sexuality of enslaved women than they had had before. You already know that enslaved people were not permitted by law or practice to form stable families. Marriage for enslaved people was not legally recognized, but people formed attachments, and enslavers encouraged this in many cases, hoping to claim any children as saleable property. You have also heard that part of the motivation for the development of gynecology in the United States was a desire on the part of enslavers to return Black women to both productive and reproductive labor. Many enslaved women practiced what birth control methods they could. They knew that their spouse, parents, or children could be sold away from them at any time. I always struggle with how to illustrate the domestic slave trade. Illustrations of people being sold, including families being separated, are viscerally distressing immediately, but they also begin to feel a bit exploitative. I chose the image on the left because it illustrates how ordinary and invisible the unthinkable had become for many of those who did not suffer. And in case you can't see it, this is a storefront for the auctioning of enslaved people. We know that enslaved people loved their family every bit as much as free people, right? We know this because they said so. And we know it because one of the very first things that freed people did in the wake of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment was to try to find family members who had been sold away. For Black families, efforts at family stability in the late 19th century were not due primarily to the cult of true womanhood in the same way as for white women. The Civil War ended in 1865, and the period after it saw the continuation of phenomenal levels of violence targeting Black people. This included sexual violence directed at Black women used as a tactic to intimidate whole groups, basically terrorism. Laws called Black Codes attempted to return freed people to all aspects of enslavement except for the name. The exact content of Black Codes varied by locality, but they all had some things in common. They made it illegal for Black people to move freely, and they made it illegal for Black people to be unemployed. And employed here meant working for white people. Black codes evolved into the Jim Crow segregation and disfranchisement laws that lasted through most of the 20th century. Even in the face of this, Black people formed and valued families. You are looking at part of the section of the Mississippi Black Codes that defined vagrancy. You do not need to write it down, but if you can enlarge it and read it, you will see how absolutely Black codes aimed to control every aspect of the lives of formerly enslaved people. While Black people could not make the fortunes that some white people could, there was still class stratification by the late 19th century, and this made a difference to family formation. Using terms associated with class stratification for white people can be misleading. For example, middle class conveys a certain level of comfort and security that hegemonic white society denied to Black people. One historian has devised a set of terms that try to reflect the reality of class stratification in Black communities. She uses working poor for those struggling just to survive. So sharecroppers, domestic laborers, underemployed seasonal workers, launderers. At the opposite end, she identifies an elite class. Ability to be in the elite class had as much or more to do with access to education than it did to money. This group included descendants of free people of color and college-educated professionals. In between these, the historian identifies what she calls an aspiring class. And you will almost certainly need to enlarge this if you actually want to read it, but it is a list of HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities. So that's an easy thing to Google if you want to. People in the aspiring class sought advanced education for their children, if not themselves, but they did not enjoy things that the white middle class took for granted, like unhindered travel and the ability to buy a home in whatever neighborhood they could afford without having it burned down. In the wake of the Civil War, members of Black communities formed a much stronger sense of responsibility for one another than white Americans did. White Americans, particularly those in the upper classes, were big on the dog-eat-dog, survival of the fittest social Darwinism that we will see in an upcoming lecture. You are looking at a group of Spelman students in 1895. Spelman is a college. Because conditions were often exceedingly difficult, infant mortality in Black populations stayed high even as it dropped for white Americans. Nevertheless, Black birth rates dropped in the wake of the Civil War for much the same reason as they did for white women: the ability to provide more for the children they had and the desire to pursue an advanced education. Caring for children in as secure an environment as possible did not just concern individual parents. The survival of children was essential to keep communities from being destroyed. The Black press grew rapidly after the Civil War. This included newspapers like the Chicago Defender, as well as a range of health and conduct manuals written for Black people by Black people, often members of the elite or aspiring classes, and many of them men. These manuals varied from author to author, but they all had in common that they articulated concepts that the race shared a destiny and that individuals could impact collective welfare by their purposefulness or carelessness. And you are looking at Josie B. Hall and the cover of the conduct manual that she wrote. Key points for Lecture 14. Despite medical and scientific developments, the types of birth control people used through the 19th century remained largely unchanged. Two improvements that came in the latter part of the 19th century were rubber condoms and safer abortions, with the advent of sterile medical technique. In the first half of the 19th century, birth control, including early-stage abortion services, could be advertised in newspapers, journals, and pamphlets. The fertility rate dropped for all groups of American women over the course of the 19th century. White men responded to both the drop in birth rates and the growth of first-wave feminism with a backlash that included making abortion and birth control illegal, the 1873 Comstock Law, making mailing anything deemed obscene, explicitly including birth control, through the U.S. mail, and race suicide rhetoric. The situation was different for Black women than other groups. Until 1865, Black people could be enslaved. Black women controlled their fertility where they could. Enslavers denied the enslaved stable families or even the ability to keep children, no matter how young. But after 1865, enslavement of people was technically illegal, but many white people in the South tried to return Black Americans to as close to an enslaved way of life as possible, using exceedingly restrictive laws, originally Black codes becoming Jim Crow segregation and disfranchisement, and extreme violence and terrorism. For many Black people, stable family formation and child health represented not only personal goals, but a commitment to the welfare of communities and the race. The coda for this lecture is basically a mini lecture on the history of birth control up to the 19th century. This is a topic that I get many questions on, and that is extremely relevant now. Actually, it's always extremely relevant, but birth control is in the public awareness in a way that it has not been for several decades. One of the oldest references to birth control comes from the Bible. In the book of Genesis, men were apparently called upon to practice coitus interruptus, commonly known as the withdrawal method. Around 3000 BCE, ancient societies, including Crete and Egypt, began developing condoms made from animal and fish bladders or intestines, as well as linen sheaths. Around 1850 BCE, Egypt developed one of the first spermicides by combining crocodile dung and fermented dough. The low pH of the dung may have had a spermicidal effect, or so I have read. The Greek philosopher Aristotle is thought to be the first person to propose using natural chemicals such as cedar oil, lead ointment, or frankincense oil as spermicides. Lead is, of course, disastrous to a human body. This photograph here, or the thing in it rather, is to me at least one of the more horrifying examples of early birth control. It's Roman and dating to 200 BCE to 400 CE, and this is a bronze pessary. A pessary in this context is a way of blocking the cervix. The hole in this one allowed a rod to be placed in the cervix to hold the pessary in place. The museum curator where I found this image noted that it could remain in place during intercourse, but that such intercourse was likely to be painful. In 23 to 79 CE, Pliny, a Roman writer of natural history, counseled his readers to refrain from sex to avoid pregnancy. He is billed as being the first known advocate of abstinence as a form of birth control. Male contraception has its own and less diverse history. Typically, male contraception has focused on avoiding disease rather than on avoiding pregnancy. There are records of sheaths being used to protect users from disease as far back as ancient times. Apparently, in the Greek legend of Minos and Pasiphae, a goat's bladder was used. In the 16th century, 1500s, the anatomist Gabriel Fallopius recommended a linen sheath to prevent syphilis. Animal guts were used to make condoms like the ones you're looking at here for hundreds of years. The use of the sheath as contraceptive and in disease prevention is well documented from the 17th century onwards. In this 18th century drawing of Casanova and a male companion, they are shown blowing up their condoms to check for holes. Until fairly recently, most condoms or sheaths were cleaned and reused. The use of the condom in the 18th century caused some controversy because segments of Western population worried that it would encourage premarital sex, sex with prostitutes, and the demise of marriage, which we see has certainly come about. Between 1725 and 1798, Casanova included in his memoirs details of his experimental forms of birth control. Included in this, he recounted his attempts to use the empty rind of half a lemon as a primitive cervical cap. Notice that Casanova has been credited with what women had been doing for a long time. In 1827, scientists finally demonstrated the existence of the female egg or the ovum. As you may remember from earlier lectures, although scientists had hypothesized that a human egg existed and had demonstrated ova from other species, they had not yet actually seen a human egg. Once again, as with the lemon cervical cap, women had inserted acid, jellies, and pastes into their vaginas to create a hostile environment for sperm for thousands of years in an attempt, often fruitless, to avoid pregnancy. Nevertheless, Charles Knowlton, a Massachusetts physician, is credited with inventing a birth control solution to be injected into the uterus by syringe after intercourse. His Fruits of Philosophy, published in 1832, discussed multiple types of contraception, including recipes for a water-based solution that included salt, vinegar, liquid chloride, and zinc sulfide or aluminum potassium sulfide. The syringe method remained in popular use for the next 40 years. In 1838, we get yet another example of men inventing something that women had been experimenting with for at least 1,000 years. In 1838, a German doctor, Friedrich Wild, offered patients a small cervical cap to cover the cervix between menstrual periods. The Wild cap, as it became known, is a precursor to the modern diaphragm. The illustration on the lower right is by Dr. Wild, showing the correct placement of the Wild cap. In 1839, Charles Goodyear, who gives his name to tires, invented the technology to vulcanize rubber. Vulcanized rubber was used to manufacture condoms, intrauterine devices, douching syringes, so they were no longer solid metal, they could be flexible tubes, and womb veils or diaphragms. With rubber and increased focus on industrial manufacturing, people no longer had to blow up their condoms to check for holes. Reusable rubber condoms replaced animal tissue condoms. Unfortunately, repeated use of rubber condoms resulted in cracking and breaking. Tune in for more on contraception and reproductive control in later lectures.